Hello, my name is Ella Whelan. I'm a columnist at Spiked, and I'm also a producer here at the Academy of Ideas, the Battle of Ideas. Welcome to the festival if you just turned up, or I hope you enjoyed the one that you were at previously. Today and now, we're going to be talking about the gender pay gap, myth or reality. This has fascinated me because it tends to really divide people. On the one hand, you have people who say the gender pay gap is a total myth, it's destructive, it's fanciful. And on the other hand, you have people who say it's absolute reality, women are being penalised, and the world of work is a very, very difficult place for women. I'm hoping that within this debate, we might push into some of the nuances of that and say, is there really still a problem for women in the workplace? Is pay really equal? Or is this whole debate that's been happening in the media, whether it be the BBC pay row, certain sports stars, has been sort of turning it into a bit of a black and white issue that isn't very helpful? We will have some stats. I welcome some stats, but I don't want this to be a stat-slinging match. I want to get into the politics of the gender pay gap and what's really going on there. And it won't just be me. I have a fantastic panelists, set of panelists here who are going to help me with that. First to speak will be Fiona Mactaggart, who, along many things, is the chair of Trustees at the Fawcett Society. I'm very glad that she's here. Then we'll have Kate Andrews, who is associate director at the Institute of Economic Affairs and columnist at City AM. Third, we'll have Rebecca Reid, who is a columnist at the Telegraph Online, a features writer at the metro.co.uk and author of a new book, Perfect Liars. And last but not least, Jess Butcher on the end, who is a co-founder of Blippar and Inspiral, a non-exec director and angel investor, and author of a TEDx talk, Is Modern Feminism Starting to Undermine Itself? So, Fiona, I wanted to start with you. The Fawcett Society has been at the forefront of talking about the gender pay gap and certainly has put out some reports in relation to it. But one of the criticisms of the reporting around the gender pay gap is that it paints this overly negative view of women's experience at work. I mean, do you really think that there is sort of deep and endemic sexism in the workplace that means that women are being penalised in relation to their pay?
The gender pay gap exists. It's not a myth. The question is, why does it exist? And it's not just discrimination, although there is some discrimination. The fact that the top jobs are held by men is actually a reflection of historic discrimination. The gender pay gap is much narrower for younger women than older women. But it's also caused by job segregation, women being more likely to do the caring jobs. It's caused by caring for family, the fact that men don't take paternity leave, although it exists. Maybe we should make it mandatory for men to take leave to care for their children. So I think that there is no question, but there is a gender pay gap. But people confuse the gender pay gap with equal pay, and it's not about direct discrimination and pay inequality.
And there's a lot of stats going around, and I get confused because lots of different organisations put out different stats in relation to the gender pay gap. Just paint us a picture of how bad you think that this is today.
Well, it depends if you take the median or the mean and whether you compare particular groups to each other. But I would say that the fairest way of assessing is that the general pay gap is around 14.1%. It can be counted in other ways, but in every way you count it, women get less pay than men. So it exists. The question is, what causes it and what can we do to end it? And that's what I hope that we will talk about today.
Thank you. Okay, Kate, I mean, answer what Fiona's just said there. There is a pay gap. It's 14.1% seems pretty significant to me. Is it true that this is what's happening? Women are being penalised for being women?
No, I don't think they are. There isn't a pay gap. There are an infinite number of pay gaps. You can calculate gender pay gaps any which way you want, depending on what you decide to include and not include. So, for example, the official figures from the Office for National Statistics say that there's a 9.1% gender pay gap for women in full-time work. They say there's a negative 5.1% gender pay gap for women in part-time work. So are there pay gaps? Yes. one in favor of women in part-time work and one in favor of men in full-time work. And that's long before you start breaking down jobs like for like. So to ask whether or not there is a pay gap is the wrong question. They're an infinite number. The question is, which ones do we care about? And what information do you think needs to be included in order to come up with a legitimate calculation as to whether or not there's some kind of discrimination going on? And I think what's happened around the gender pay gap reporting measures, but frankly was happening even before with some campaign groups. So there's actually quite a sinister attempt to press the reset button on women's progress in the workplace. We're getting to the point where there are actually negative gender pay gaps in favor of women. And that was a little bit too good for a lot of these groups that want to perpetuate victimhood culture. And so they pressed the reset button and they said, we need to get some really big statistics back out there. So we're really meant to believe that in 2018, about 40 years after there was genuinely a discrimination between men and women in the workplace and their pay, that these big companies have 60% gender pay gaps, that Ryanair and EasyJet have 52% gender pay gaps. Sorry, negative 5.1, 9.1, they're just doing a bit too well. Let's go back to those outrageous statistics. And in paragraph 5 or 6 of that BBC article, let's explain that actually this is not a totally legitimate example of the gender pay gap. There are issues around jobs here. We're definitely not comparing like for like. Female pilots, male pilots, they get paid the same. But that's at the bottom of the article. At the top are these statistics, I think, to make young women in particular feel like this glass ceiling is still there and prominent and like they can't get through it. Some people benefit from that, but women don't. So we need to be a lot more honest about these conversations, and I think overall, the picture is extremely positive for women in the workplace. Of course, there are moments of sexism, and we have laws to combat that, but overall, it's much more positive than it's usually portrayed.
Rebecca, you write a lot about this, and a lot of the time when people talk about the gender pay gap, those who say that there is a gender pay gap, they often attribute it to the patriarchy or to sexism. And there's this sort of overriding idea that it's like planned. It's planned that women get paid less. It's the fault of sexist bosses because they don't want to pick women because they might have kids or because they just don't like women, they don't value them as well. Is it as simple as that kind of base prejudice against women? Or is there something else going on?
So I don't think that there's like a group of white men in suits in a boardroom made of glass sitting around being like, how can we keep women down? I don't think that's happening. And I think it's a little bit lazy when we just say everything's the patriarchy's fault. I'm guilty of it, but I think it's a bit lazy. I think the reality is, so if, for instance, if we talk about the Ryanair pay gap, it's a really good example. Female pilots and male pilots paid the same. People who work as cabin crew paid a lot less than driving a plane. Flying a plane. Because flying a plane takes a lot more training and arguably it's more responsibility to be keeping it in the air than serving drinks and helping with health and safety. So should a female cabin crew member be paid the same as a pilot? No, obviously that's ridiculous. But way more men become pilots than women because, and I think, and you know, there was a scandal recently where they were handing out stickers to kids on a Thompson holiday flight, 2E I think it's called now, and they were giving girls future cabin crew ones and boys future pilot ones, and lots of people were like, oh, it's not a big deal, get over it. But the thing is, women do take fewer of these massive, heavy-hitting, super well-paid jobs, and if that, and we know that's happening, that's kind of undebatable. So why is it happening? Is it that women are actually less ambitious through genetics? I don't think so. Or is it that we raise them to expect less, which is what I think is happening? So I think that the pay gap is sort of our fault, but it's our fault because of the way we've been conditioned to expect to be treated.
I mean, what would you say would be the solution to that? Because one of the top, in the gender pay gap reporting, the top industry that had the worst gender pay gap, I think, was construction. And you can kind of understand that. And you don't often get lots of women campaigning for women to be bricklayers. But what is the solution to something like that then? If we think that it's unjust that there are pay gaps in industries like that, whether it be flying planes, whether it be making houses, what solution would you suggest to fixing that?
I mean, I think the solution to almost everything that's affecting women is subsidised, really, really good, solid gold childcare. I think construction's a really tricky one because I'm not going to pretend that I think that women are across the board physically as strong as men. And my cousin's a bricklayer and he's like, no way would I hire a woman because she's not going to be able to do it as well. But the reality is, women who want to do that should be able to. If you're willing to be in the gym all week and eating 100 chicken breasts a week so that you're stronger and you can do it, fair play to you, you shouldn't experience any kind of judgment. But broadly speaking, it does happen in things where physical strength is, like pilots, that's not a physical thing. But being a pilot, if you've got 3 kids, the social stigma, the pressure, can you imagine being at a dinner party being like, yeah, I'm away 28 weeks a year and my kids are at boarding school? People would be horrified if you're a woman. And I think if you're a man, it would be, you wouldn't get the same judgment at all.
Jess, now, as I understand it, you are a gender pay gap skeptic of sorts. And I wanted to ask you about the nuance in this, because on the one hand, you have the sort of an understandable reaction against the pay gap reporting, because lots of people say that, the fact is that it is illegal to pay men and women differently. And lots of people were sceptical of the fact that this got made big about the BBC pay gaps. We were talking about women and men who had telephone book number, size pay checks, and lots of people thought, well, why on earth would I care about that kind of pay gap? But what kind of effect does this reporting have on women, if any? Are you worried about it discouraging women from going into certain workplaces because they think they'll be disadvantaged? Is this leading to a confidence gap, perhaps?
Yeah, I do worry cumulatively about the effect on women's confidence around this narrative of discrimination and disadvantage, which the gender pay gap is definitely a part of, and is probably the most legitimised part of, because there's general consensus across party politics now that this is a problem and that we need to respond to it. I guess my perspective, I should say I'm not a sceptic, I do accept that it exists. I think I have 3 quite interesting perspectives on it, though. One is as an employer and a business owner and a boss and someone that sits on boards. The second is as a woman of exactly the age at which the gender pay gap starts to occur. So women in their 20s and 30s are earning exactly the same as men. It's at my age and beyond that it begins to happen. And the third is as a representative of this high-flying, ambitious, sort of top-level women in business and their careers that the gender pay gap debate seems to be obsessed with, I think to the exclusion of everybody else, actually, for whom it matters more. So I wanted to share with you a couple of observations, particularly on those last 2 that I've had. One is, I graduated from Oxford, went to a great school, and at 21, I witnessed many of my most successful and high-achieving friends making career choices at that age to go into sectors that were less well paid. So media or retail or medicine choices that weren't going to take them into surgery, for example. And we weren't stupid. We knew exactly what we were doing. We could have applied for finance and consultancy, and of course many women did, but in higher numbers we chose those less well-paid professions at that junction. And the next junction is now, the age at which many of my friends are starting families. And these are women that were at the very top of all of their professions throughout their 20s and 30s, now choosing, actually a majority of them now choosing to step back from wanting the top flight careers, step back from wanting to make partner, I've heard friends say, into 3-day working weeks, 4-day working weeks, and some choosing to quit altogether from incredibly impressive professions because they simply want balance in their lives. They want to spend time with young families, and I don't think anybody's talking about choice as a positive here. We're telling women that money and status is all that we should be aspiring to. And that, to me, is just depressing because there's so much more to life that women are enjoying. And I'm afraid I do believe that women work to live, or a greater percentage of women work to live and have a greater sense of balance in their lives than men who live to work. And I think we should be recognising the positives in the gender pay gap and also some of the negatives for men, which is that they're working longer and harder. There's actually a commuting gender gap, which I read about recently, that men are commuting 40% longer than women. There's a survey in the States that talks about full-time men are working 42 more minutes a day than women, which is 3.5 hours a week, 14 hours a month, the equivalent of 18 days a year. Nobody in the UK is going to commission that research, I guarantee it, because it's not following the mantra of gender pay gap equals discrimination, which we're all agreeing isn't just the case, but to the general public, that's all they hear. They're not hearing about the nuance, and that to me is obscuring everything and is a real worry for women.
I loved hearing what you were saying because I'm doing a study of that, but I'm doing women who are older than what you're talking about, as I am. And what happens, those women at home, many are happy, some are not, when their children grow up, what do they want to do with all their talents? And from my research, there are about a third who can get back in, but the rest have trouble. They have trouble relating to the equal pay gap of being paid or being at the right level equal to what they should be. So how can we help them at that point?
I'd like to try and bring a bit of romance into the discussion, because I just wondered if you ever considered the role that mate selection might play in this. For example, it's been my experience that men tend to do what, generally tend to do what women will reward. Women tend to, really, women generally marry equal or higher earners. Men tend to marry for love. We'll marry, you know, which that if you make us competitive to get the top level woman be a higher earner, we will. And there's no obligation for success for the woman, and you know she has options. If you're a lawyer working 40 hours a week or 80 hours a week, and so is your husband, you might be inclined to say, actually, I'll just let him do it, and I'll go enjoy my family. The man doesn't have that option. I think we've done a great job of bringing women into the workplace. We haven't done a good job of bringing men into the home.
Okay. With the glasses.
Hi, I just wanted you to discuss the less business side of the gender pay gap. So like athletes, where male athletes get paid, the top level male athletes get paid a lot more than the top level female athletes. And like, I want you to discuss like, how we could solve this.
The point I wanted to make that gentleman very kindly made earlier about mate selection, where women generally are looking for someone who's of equal status or higher, and that is an underlying motivation as to why men want to be CEOs and most women don't, because women want to marry the CEOs in general. There's been lots of studies and evidence that prove that is the case. Feminists and people who are concerned about this don't tend to address this subject at all, because it requires asking women to stand up and talk about the choices they make. The second point I want to make is about the subsidised childcare. Sorry, it's just the question I asked to the panel is who is going to pay for this subsidised childcare, because the majority of taxes are paid by men.
Media often portray women as weak and damsels in distress, and media, me as well, and like my school friends, media plays and the news plays a huge role in our lives and influence us. So do you think the media plays a role in kind of accentuating the gender pay gap?
I heard you talk a bit about the age where the pay gap starts to become a factor. I was wondering whether you thought that was because that's the age where people tend to have families, or whether you think it's because older people will have experienced more discrimination in the workplace when they began their careers.
It is really interesting. Women get a pay penalty for being mothers. Men get a pay bonus for being fathers. I mean, you know, you couldn't make it up, frankly. I think that the childcare issue is really critical. And I think that there are two things we need to do. Yes, we need to have subsidised childcare, but we actually need to enable more men to look after their families and make that a normal, proper, regular thing to do. Not to feel that you're somehow being soppy and wet, but actually to make it your right. And that means, I think, that a second carer should get mandatory rights to parental leave, and it should be paid at the same rate, at least, as it is for a mother. And you could begin to change male attitudes to childcare. I think I can see shifts happening in it already. The other thing is about when the pay gap starts widening. It does start widening amongst older women. And that's partly when people have had a gap from their paid employment. It's really striking that so many women lose their jobs when they're pregnant. And there's been many fewer cases of pregnancy discrimination taken to the courts, not because it stopped, but because the government introduced really punitive fees for people taking those cases, which immediately led to an 80% reduction in cases. So I think that the evidence is pretty clear. I think the solution is to do with childcare, it's also to do with how we value different jobs. And it's true that women choose less well-paid jobs than men. But, for example, the most likely job for a woman as her first career is nursing. The most likely job for a man in his first career is programming and coding. Is there a good reason why programming and coding is paid 25% better at an entry level than nursing? I'm not convinced there is. So I think there are some things that we need to do as a society about talking about what is valuable to us.
Some brilliant questions that indicate, I think, how much nuance there is. In particular, I think we're all in agreement that where the playing field in the workplace has started to level out much better, we haven't yet leveled the playing field for men in the homes. And we definitely need to do that. And I think all these questions around provision of childcare are critical to enabling women to have choice. Only to the extent, though, that choice isn't then forcing them to say, you have to go back to work. And I think that's the biggest concern, that if we're saying men have to take paternity or we're forcing this to be equal, then we're actually undermining women's choice to stay at home. And we're also telling women, by the way, that they have to breastfeed, and they have to be the perfect parents and they have to act in a certain way when it comes to mothering. And, it's not fair for women that they have to go back to work and to equal out this gender pay gap. And I think working class women are more affected by this, actually, than professional women, because if the choice is between going back to doing some manual labour and being paid for that, versus staying at home and enjoying time with your children and doing that manual labour in your own home, then they're much more likely to make that choice. So I think that's critical. One of the questions, I think, in terms of market rate, which we might come back to, but I wanted to represent business here on this question. And somebody asked the question around athletes and women being underpaid in other spheres outside of business. And I think it's good that light's being shone on that, but the one thing that people never ask is the maths and marketability of female sports versus male sports, for example. These are businesses. Yes, they might be cultural businesses, but they sell tickets. And if they sell more male tickets and a man is more marketable and makes them more money, then that tends to be reflected in pay. And there are competitive marketplaces. We employ individuals, not a chromosome box tick. And that's often forgotten. I hire women, and I'm afraid if women return from maternity with either a lessened, fewer hours for a start, or different ambitions about where they want to go in life, or a different work ethic, then I will reflect that in their pay, because I have a business to run and I don't wish to penalise those people who haven't had that impact on their lives, that are still working exactly as many hours, as hard, prepared to travel as much. And I think nobody asks businesses that question, and businesses are ashamed of actually answering in that way.
I think there's so much. My background's in kind of sex and relationships and dating, so I want to talk a little bit about the things we looked at in the idea of mate selection. Sounded a little bit red pill. There was a bit of a sort of Reddit-y vibe to me for that one. I have a very knee-jerk reaction to this idea that women hunt out wealthy men and then trap them with their hot young bods and then use them to never work again. I know that's not what you're saying, but you were saying the nice side of, and there is a very real community of men, mostly on the internet, who genuinely believe that women use their sexy cultural capital to trap them, to make them work forever, to enslave them so that they don't have to work. And I think there's two things. I think there's men think that staying at home with children is a lovely, chilled out day. I've been a nanny, I can tell you it's not. Like, children, looking after kids is really, really hard work. I'm sure everybody here knows that. But there is a misconception that you get a meal ticket by marrying a wealthy man and then you don't want to work and we're just making a fuss about this because we can. The reality is, to start with, I don't think that women do hunt down. I know you said women want to marry a CEO. Personally, I'd rather be a CEO and marry a CEO because, then we've got a good situation going. But broadly speaking, I think if there is a situation in which women want to marry wealthy, powerful men, it's because they are raised to expect that. And I know everyone's going to find this really boring, but fairy tales do genuinely teach young girls that you are supposed to be a docile, sweet a woman without agency who is swept off her feet and brought into a marriage and taken care of. And we are genuinely raised with that expectation. So no wonder even those of us who are super woke and really feminist still start to have that thing about wait, shouldn't you be paying for dinner? And I think we have to understand that that if we do have that expectation, we can break it, because it's just as lots of women do want to be the CEO rather than marry them.
I think there's a very clear reason why coders are paid more than nurses, and it's because that there is a lack of supply of people who have that very particular and very, very specific and very important skill.
And
that
there's
does
a lack of supply of nurses.
That's because of our immigration policies, which I bet you and I would agree on need to be more liberalized. But fundamentally, it can be much harder to become a good coder than it can become to be a good nurse. That doesn't mean that being a nurse is not an incredibly vital and important job, but it's very obvious as to why the market is going to reward the lack of supply. So the real question is not why are coders paid more than nurses, but why aren't there more female coders? And I think Jess is completely right that women tend to have a much healthier perspective on the balance of work and life. And this idea that in order for us to be equal, women have to follow the man's pathway is absolutely ridiculous. If we do want to promote some kind of feminist mantra, why are we trying to adopt exactly what men do? I'm aware that in my own life, I work for an educational charity. I am the gender pay gap, right? I could have gone off to work for a big bank, but I decided to work for an educational charity. And we're coming very close to pointing fingers at people like me, and I'm sure many of the women out in this room saying you've made the wrong choice because our goal is a 0% gender pay gap, so let me just fiddle and mess with your life and your choices until I get the statistic that I want. That's not very liberalizing or freedom maximizing. And just to break up the romance a little bit, I'm sorry to do it as well. I'm actually much more interested not in what women say they want out of their male partner. That's going to be obvious, but what they're scared to see in themselves when men look at them. There was a study there was a piece in the New York Times months ago that flagged up a few different studies, and one of them showed that when women were asked to write down what they wanted to succeed in life, what they wanted their salary to be and their job title, they wrote it down, and then when they were told that a prospective partner might look at it, they downgraded their ambitions. Similarly, there was another study in the same article that said that men were very happy for their partner to earn lots and lots of money, as long as it was a little bit less than what they earned. And for me, issues around the gender pay gap are deeply cultural, and we have a lot more we can do to support the women in our lives and to make them feel like they should succeed. I want to stop demonizing businesses, because I think businesses are actually some of the biggest advocates for women. They're getting them on that pay ladder, they're promoting them, and yet that's what the media always targets. We need to be targeting ourselves if we're going to fix this.
I read something recently about how older women and more experienced women in the workplace are penalizing younger women because back when they were at that age, the standard was much higher. So they're the women in their eyes are falling short of what they had to do, which on one side is a sign of progress because the younger women don't have to be as excellent as the older women were at the time. And while that's obviously not the only factor or the most significant factor to the gender pay gap, do you think women not supporting each other enough in the workplace is a factor towards women having trouble rising up?
At the very beginning, Fiona talked about wanting to know what the reason for the gender pay gap was and then wanting to try to eliminate it. It doesn't, whether one wants to eliminate it, depend on what the reason is, such that if the reason is the exercise of people's free choice, eliminating which will be disturbingly authoritarian.
I've been very interested in arguments around the gender pay gap, and I've been following these debates very closely for a number of years now. And it's interesting to see some shifts that have occurred in the message that campaigners put out. So one very important shift that's taken place is that campaigning groups such as the Fawcett Society used to use a median statistic, which comes in at roughly 9.6%, and then switched to a mean statistic, which comes in at conveniently a far larger 14% roughly. Another thing that's changed, I think, and it occurred to me, real stark change in the past year, where campaigners now go to great lengths to say, oh no, we're not talking about equal pay, we're talking about a gender pay gap. We absolutely accept that men and women doing the same work get paid the same amount. But that's something really new. And there's the whole heap of dishonesty here, because for the past 5 years, that distinction has not been drawn clearly. And it's campaigning groups that have deliberately obfuscated and deliberately allowed that confusion to creep into the discussion. And I really agree with the people on the panel who were saying that the impact on particularly young women of all this confusion, of exaggerating the statistics for effect, actually becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where young women think, well, what's the point of me aiming to the top or trying to get a good salary, because I'm just going to hit all these insurmountable obstacles. I'm just going to get hit by the gender pay gap. I won't even bother trying.
Hi. I had, well, two very quick points. The first was, do we reach too quickly to intervene in situations where sometimes time might correct itself? I think it's correct to say that there are more women leaving university now than their male counterparts. So if we're still having this conversation in 20 years, then perhaps we need to actually say that's there, but surely it might well correct itself, and it will come down to just a simple matter of choice that people are making. And the other one, a very quick point, I think it would be a very good idea to make maternity and paternity rights equal, but I don't think we have to make that mandatory on men. I think that's very, it's a very negative image of men that they wouldn't want to do it as if they see it beneath them, and I haven't heard anything that seems to say a man would see it beneath himself to rear his own children.
When I was growing up, I just assumed that women were equal and should be equal and they can do anything a man can do. I'm quite old now, so I'm not sure this is a particularly radical or new idea in society. But I do wonder whether the push for women's equality today is actually very helpful in the way that I think it was historically, because it seems to be more about a form of separatism than it is about trying to find something common. I particularly find it curious that a lot of the women that seem to promote this idea seem to be quite wealthy and quite successful. And it doesn't seem to be women that, like, if you call it normal women, you know, being successful, why is that not normal? If you know what I mean, people are lower down on the wage scale don't seem to be arguing this, nor do I think that most people experience the world as a gender war. They experience it in terms of, well, is my husband going to do this? Am I going to do that? What we're going to do with the kids, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. And I wonder if we need to just get beyond the gender thing and say, actually, there isn't a gender war. There's one being constructed by these arguments, but in the real world, we need to think about, well, how do we create a good society for all of us and develop that language rather than think we can actually break through this discussion, which seems to be, as I say, quite negative, destructive and separatist.
Hi. So I really agree with the idea of the childcare subsidization, and you know the consensus seems to be that everyone agrees with that too. But I worry it kind of also still implies that the motherhood is an essential aspect, or parenthood is an essential aspect for people when they grow up and go into jobs that, well, not everyone might want to be a parent. And I get that this might not be the majority view, but if we kind of focus just on okay, let's get a good childcare subsidization program going, what does that do for those who, whether it's choice or not, don't have children or don't want to go into families, and how do they deal with sort of these job differences? Thanks.
When I didn't use stats at the beginning, you made me use stats. Because I don't think that the median and the mean, I don't think that that is actually the relevant. All the way you do the stats. I mean, for example, I've avoided including part-time and full-time because women are much more likely to be part-time. I've only referred to the full-time pay gap, but actually, if you look at the hourly pay of women, in practice, it's a bigger gap than that. So I'm not trying to expand the stats. I don't think the stats are at the heart of it. The problem is that it exists. I don't think anyone says it doesn't exist. The question is, and some people are challenging it, whether it's a problem. If women choose to go through these low-paid jobs, isn't that fine? I don't think there's compelling evidence that this is caused by women choosing to do low-paid jobs. Because, first of all, the jobs which are poorly paid, in my judgment, are partly, of course there's an issue of market, but they are partly a product of a gender discriminatory society and history which values things differently. The fact that men are concentrated in the top jobs are actually, they're doing it at the end of their careers, at the time when the pay gap is biggest between women and men, and that is a product of historical sexual discrimination. So I think I'm not arguing for separatism. I am arguing for an equal society in which one of the changes that we make is encouraging men and enabling men to take a bigger part in the care of their children. Now, I'm not a parent. I don't have children. I am infertile. But actually, I want other people to have children. I want someone to pay for my pension, frankly. And, you know, I think a society with children is a good society. And therefore, I am quite prepared to pay through my taxes for their education and for their care. And I hope that the rest of us are too. But the problem about the present arrangement of parental leave for fathers is it's not well paid enough for men to take it. And in those countries where there's a use it or lose it, and you might say that this is Fiona being frightfully Stalinist and dictatorial, in those countries where there's a use it or lose it father's paternity leave, men take it. And actually, in those countries, men are more likely to be involved in the care of their children. And looking after children is very hard work, but it's also great fun. And I think a society where we equalise childcare more will make more difference. I'm just going to grab into that low-paid women point. Is this just about those of us who are rich? 60% of those people who are paid less than the real living wage are women. Women are concentrated at very low pay. And I tell you, they suffer more from unequal pay than women at the rich end.
This idea that statistics aren't at the heart of the gender pay gap issue, I just fundamentally disagree with. If stats and evidence isn't at the heart of this issue, then it just depends on how we all feel about the gender pay gap. And that's not going to get us anywhere. Ella's going to kill me if I start going down the stats route, but I think it's really important to look at, with all due respect to the Fawcett Society, to look at their major campaign every year around the gender pay gap. It's called Equal Pay Day. Right? Haven't we all just agreed that the gender pay gap and equal pay day are two fundamentally different things? It claims that women start working for free at that point of the year because of the gender pay gap. Women are not working for free. If you do a different job, if you are this 22-year-old researcher, your CEO is going to be making more than you. That does not mean you're working for free from sometime in November to the end of the year. And the politics around this is just baffling to me. It is an attempt to put a worldview that isn't based on evidence into the public domain, and in my opinion, to frighten a lot of women with it. The Equal Pay Day campaign breaks down regionally what the gender pay gap is in their report. One region was left off last year, and that region was Northern Ireland. It happens to be the one region with a positive gender pay gap. Don't tell me that this isn't political. Don't tell me this isn't about statistics. You're omitting the evidence that shows women doing well, trying to hike up the numbers that show that they're not. And someone at the very beginning of this mentioned that women need to help each other more. And I think it brings us into this idea of what the bad feminist is. The bad woman, the woman who wants to look at the maths and actually say, are we doing so poorly? They're left out. They're excluded from these debates. They're excluded from these circles. We're not supporting or helping women by putting numbers on them and putting stats on them that just aren't legitimate. And I would just quickly end on childcare subsidies, because actually I think I may be the one person on the panel who doesn't think that that is simply the answer. The UK has some of the highest costs of childcare in the OECD. We are constantly subsidizing healthcare, and it's just racking up the price. And families of color are most left out because they're the least likely to use traditional forms of childcare. And so we do have an issue with childcare, and we need to get more people access to it. It's not obvious that ramming more money into the system we currently have is going to make any kind of difference.
Are feminists painting an overly negative picture of the gender pay gap, twisting stats to make women feel bad about work?
I mean, short answer, no. So I, as my job, I write about feminism all day, every day, and I am the perpetually offended person whining about things that people don't think are a problem. That's my whole job. And why do I do that? Because all of those little tiny microaggressions that you all think are really stupid do actually add up to something much bigger. When we talk about, there was some movement over here about the idea that talking about negative statistics puts women off and makes them too scared to go into jobs. I think that's so patronising to young women. This narrative has been going since I was a teenager. I'm in my mid-20s now. And I looked at that and I went, fuck that, I'll have some money, please. I'm not going to accept less pay than somebody else. And it fired me up. And I think it's very patronising to young women to assume that hearing a scary statistic is going to make them go, do you know what, maybe I'll just be a mother and I'll learn how to make really good muffins. Because women are better than that. But maybe it does need to be tempered with a narrative of, you might be offered less money, this is how you ask for more. And one thing we haven't talked about today is women, I think, can be really bad about asking for more because, again, I know I keep saying this, we're raised to be sugar and spice and all things nice, not to go into our boss's office and go, I need more money because I have to buy food. And I think that's really, really important. We need to empower women to go in and say, just to clarify, what are the pay grades in this company? What is Michael, who sits across from me, earning? Am I getting the same? And to take responsibility for that yourself on a micro level. But I'm terrible at it. Every woman I know is bad at it.
Yeah, I think women are getting better at negotiating. I don't think we're as good at as men, definitely. But there is something that a byproduct of what's happening now is that there was a lovely question raised about whether women support women. And I think the things that hold women back are, firstly, themselves. Secondly, other women. And then circumstance. And circumstance are about individuals. Now, if you get passed over for promotion by a woman will typically say, well, she's a bitch, she doesn't recognise my skills. But if you get passed over for promotion by a guy, the response will be, the patriarchy, it's because of discrimination and it's because I'm a woman. And I'm having so many people coming to me. I'm looking at entrepreneurs who are pitching for money to venture capitalists and they're saying, I didn't get that money because I'm a woman. Men get all the money, women entrepreneurs don't get the money. And I want to say to them, I'm really sorry, I was in that pitch. It was a bad pitch. And you can't say that. You know, there's this get out clause that I think has now become the mantra, which is doing us no favours whatsoever. Somebody else made the point that, you know, will this get improved because we're coming through, women are coming through in our 20s and our 30s. So, you know, is this going to change dramatically? I'm not sure it will, because it's a motherhood gap. It is not a gender gap. If you look at full-time non-mothers, so women who haven't had children, the gender pay gap between women and men is 99%, like 1% or 2%, I understand. So this only affects mothers. And it's a choice that mothers are making. And I think ageism, by the way, we didn't answer that other lady's question about, you know, how we bring people back in. That's the next ism. That's my prediction for the room, that the next ism that everybody's going to be getting upset with is ageism and age discrimination, which I think will be a valid point to make, because there's so much talent that needs to be embraced that comes back into the workforce.
Actually, weirdly, we do have consensus on the panel, I think, which is that women don't ask as much as women don't push for more pay. I'm not convinced about that fact, so if anyone wants to answer that question, I'd like to hear it.
Some of you talked about socialisation, that impact of that on women's choices, but I don't really know how you can measure that, because in the most equal societies, say like in Scandinavian countries, when they try to pursue like gender-neutral policies in schools and try to encourage women to go into high-paid jobs, still women make choices to go into different professions. So I don't know, like, if you have statistics or evidence to say how socialisation impacts our choices.
Yeah, just Fiona Mactaggart's point about, I just wanted to say, if women have the choice between getting money which they can spend on childcare or money which they can have and stay at home and look after their own children, as they do in Finland, they will choose to stay at home and look after their children. So making it paternity leave compulsory could be taking some choice away from women. But my main thing that I want to say is I really think that we shouldn't worry about ending the gender pay gap, because it is purely an expression, or almost only an expression, of choice. The reason we attach a lot of importance to it is because we think that money is a source of power, and therefore women are getting less money, they must be less powerful. The fact is, if you look at spending, women do between 70 to 80% of spending. So whether or not women are earning the money, they have access to the money and they are spending it. And therefore, we really don't need to worry about the gender pay gap because they're getting the money anyway.
To me, this debate has been very sort of Western-centred, and I was wondering if the panellists believe that in countries, especially sort of in the Middle East, where there's a genuine problem with getting women into work in the first place due to them having a lower sort of living standard in general, should we as a Western country intervene and try and help them socially, therefore to boost them economically?
Just a very quick point. I think it's impossible to have this discussion without talking about the family structures and how they've changed, and we haven't talked much about that. So men and women seeing each other as single economic entities. There are many, many more single parents now, and this whole access to subsidised childcare. I really disagree with the idea of in any way forcing men to take paternity and that being somehow equal to what we give on maternity. I don't know if people realise how poor maternity pay is and what the period of time is. We talk about having babies as if it's like Christmas, it's all over after 6 months. You know, it's a lifetime, isn't it? And it's about how we want to live as society and who brings up children.
Yeah, a few years ago, a male friend of mine who I worked with wanted to go part-time, and he was told, no, we can't do that here. And it was true. There was no one had gone part-time at that point, so he left. He's doing other stuff. But since then, I think there must be 5 female colleagues who've constructed kind of bespoke work patterns for themselves in this same place. In my experience, women of my generation are really good at getting what they want. That sounded bitter. I don't mean it like that. I admire them for it. You know, I think that the point is they knew what they wanted and they thought about how to get it and they got it, and good for them. But the thing is, it's just not always salary that they want.
Kate, I really enjoyed your spat with Stella Creasy on, I think, the Daily Politics a couple of months back. But if I can go back to the case of Carrie Gracie, who I believe was the China correspondent for the BBC, who discovered that she was paid much less than a male counterpart who covered the North American brief. Bear in mind that, Carrie Gracie's brief was much more difficult to do. Isn't it quite right that we should call this out as gender prejudice? Because, I mean, if she was no good at her job, she should be bloody well sacked. And this is not some sort of gimmick put forward by Labour MPs and their left-wing chums.
On the effects on businesses, I think the effects on businesses is potentially really difficult because I run a business. We're just about to be required to produce our numbers this year. They'll look awful. When we compare with what all our competitors have done, they've introduced all these kind of things. Oh, we're doing this, we've got this policy, we've got that policy. I just want to publish them and say they're nonsense. Here they are, they're nonsense. But that's a hard thing for businesses to do. It's hard to win that argument. And I really do fear that a lot of those businesses who are introducing those policies are actually promoting women who are not good enough because they want to massage the figures. And I do not think that is good for women or for men.
Earlier we spoke about athletes and how male sports, if people are more interested in male sports, then the men will be paid more, which makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is the pay gap in the entertainment industry. For example, I watch a show that is aimed at people for my age, teenagers. My friends watch it, we all watch it together. There are 4 main characters. Those 4 main characters are women. Now, they get paid less than their male co-stars, who are not in every episode, not on the posters. So why does that happen?
I agree with Hilary, and I agree with all the nuance, but when orchestras started auditioning behind screens, the number of women in orchestras went up. So how do we deal with this when you can't be interviewed behind a screen?
Hello there, a proud muffin-making man here.
You're the
Kate,
muffin man.
Thank you. Kate made a point at the beginning just in terms of the infinity of pay gaps throughout various sectors. She mentioned sort of Northern Ireland and regional pay gaps being one of them, which I'd be interested to hear the explanation there. I also wanted to look at another pay gap, and that is in between sort of ages of different individuals, and particularly around sort of beginnings of the career between around the ages of 16 to 21. That is, so before women go to university, during and perhaps even immediately after, where women typically tend to earn more than men. I mean, my understanding or my takeaway from that would be because women of that age are seen as more responsible, probably more presentable. I think that's probably fair enough. So my question, therefore, is: are there certain pay gaps or prejudices which we tend to either see as not an issue or even positive and a fair assumption?
So the main thing I really wanted to say, the comment about women having all the money and doing all the spending really annoyed me, because women do all of the food shopping, they buy school uniforms, they do all of the women are do the vast majority of the childcare. The money that they spend, the vast majority of that isn't going to get your nails done and getting a blow dry. It's because they control the household spending, because women who do domestic unpaid labour have to do that. And I think that leads really neatly into something that I would really like to try encourage people to think about, is that taking a career gap to raise children is not just sitting around with your feet up. It is running a business. It is balancing the books. It is being an accountant. It's being a nurse. It's being a million different things. Being a mother is work experience and it's valid. It makes you a project manager. And I think it'd be really great if employers could try and see all of the things that women do in their role as mothers.
I guess my problem with this all is the oversimplistic narrative that the vast majority of people, everyone in this room has got a greater sense of the nuance here, but the headline statistic around the gender pay gap on which there is consensus across all the political parties and where there is evidence being actively sought out to promote this message by organisations like the Fawcett Society is to say the gender pay gap equals discrimination, equals patriarchy. Women, you are suffering. And I just think that as an assumption, and it is an assumption, it's certainly not in question, and evidenced by the fact that 75% of people believe that the gender pay gap does refer to unequal pay for equal work, which is categorically false. And I worry that nobody is asking or looking into data that will support another side to this argument, one that supports choice and to say, yes, it exists, but is this a bad thing? And what are the positives about it with regards to the options open to women and how we choose to live our lives? And to ask the question, why is it all about money and status? Why is it not about balance, choice and families? And where are the rights of the children in all of this, in actual fact?
I want to nail a couple of myths. One, that the Fawcett Society says that this is all about discrimination. I have in front of me our last year's briefing on the gender pay gap, and it says quite specifically, there is no one cause of the pay gap. Important factors are discrimination, which is important, as the colleague up there.
Number one, discrimination.
No, hang on. This isn't listed. Are discrimination, undervaluing roles predominantly done by women, dominance of men in best paid positions, and unequal caring responsibility. So discrimination is real. The example of the orchestra is one. The university in the States, which when it wasn't doing blind recruiting, assessed male applications as worth $4,000 a year in pay more than female applications. There is real examples of discrimination. This is not just women choosing. Women don't choose not to be the CEO. Some women do, but generally women don't choose not to be the CEO. And the fact that only 6% of CEOs in the FTSE 100 companies are women seems to me to be a suggestion, at least, that there is discrimination. I wanted briefly to just touch on the women who talked about women around the world. I don't think that we're going to be able to solve the appalling sexism of societies in the Middle East, but one of the global things that really is worth us all knowing is that women work for much longer hours than men, but most of those hours are unpaid. And globally, this is a really serious issue for women. You're twitching at me, so I will begin to shut up. I think we could use some direct action, like ensuring that fathers get decent pay so that they take paternity leave. Make every job flexible if it can be. And actually considering quotas. I was a beneficiary of a quota. When I stood for Parliament, I stood on a women's only shortlist and would not have been elected as the MP for Slough if it hadn't been a women only seat. And I defy you to suggest that the women who were elected on women only shortlists were less good than the men. Actually, in my experience, they were better and more effective MPs.
Fiona, I don't know you personally, but I'm going to believe that you could have been elected with or without a quota, because women are incredible and they're smart and they're talented, and we don't need that extra step up. We're just as good as the men. You could have been elected. We can be elected without that help. I think the mention of Carrie Gracie is very interesting. What a way to sum it up. Carrie Gracie, extremely talented broadcaster, came to believe that, as in her words, the BBC had a secret and illicit pay culture. She, of course, had not seen the contracts of the other people who were theoretically on her same level, because that would be illegal and bad. But she took this to the media, she took it to Parliament, she took it to select committees. The one place she didn't take it was court. She did. She didn't, not properly, and that's extremely telling that she has not done a proper lawsuit yet. She did this all through back channels, and not just back channels, front channels too, through the media. The one thing that she did not do is actually take them to say, prove to me that legally you are paying me less than men. And I think that that is particularly telling, that when women, we do have these channels in which, if there is secret and illicit pay culture, we can do something about it. But we base most of this on feelings and on the fact that we think there might be discrimination involved. So I would just encourage particularly young women to look at the evidence and the facts, and to look at a bunch of different statistics and figure out actually what's happening in your area, in your sector, and in the UK overall. Because if we just base this on feelings and on media headlines and on emotion and on MPs and the rest of it, we're not going to get to the heart of it. And at the heart of it, women are doing extremely well.
Please thank my speakers.